I'd like to welcome you to my Thursday Bread History Seminar Workshop. I am broadcasting from my kitchen in Santa Cruz, California. My name is William Rubel. You can find my book, Bread, A Global History, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online sources, possibly also at your public library. I'm writing a larger bread history, and really this work in the seminar series is feeding into this new work that I'm writing. So thank you very much for watching. You can go to my Facebook group, Bread History in Practice, join the group. That's where you will get notifications of the live seminars, and also you will see what people are posting who have attended the seminar. If you want to make breads that are mentioned, then go to my website, williamrubel.com. I don't have all of the recipes from each of these seminars posted, but increasingly I do. So you should look there first in the category seminar. Now I always start with the same two slides. And so I'm going to do that now. Bread is an invention, like a chair, a car, a shoe, or a necklace. No farmer anywhere has ever harvested a bread. They aren't picked from trees, they aren't dug from the ground, they're not reaped from a field. What if reaped from a field is grain, and it then has to be ground and processed, sifted, all kinds of things have to happen to it in order to finally become a bread. And when you add what the baker who makes the bread is kind of a servant of culture, and every choice the baker makes, this is really important and important for today. Every choice the baker makes is determined by the culture in which the baker lives. It can include what breads the family wants to eat. Bakers were women. Since the dawn of time, most bakers were women. The kind of grain, whether it's a big loaf, small loaf, leavened, unleavened, yeast, sourdough, flat, loaf, open crumb, small crumb, all the details, do you throw an egg into it? Do you add whey? Do you have milk? All of these things are determined by culture and what the culture wants at any time. So when you look at bread, you are looking also at fashion. And what I find interesting about bread, and has been worth my while spending the last 20 years thinking about it, is that really, I think through getting down to the details of the recipe, we get insights into the underlying culture that are otherwise not able to find. Well, when you look up at the stars at night, and those of you who live outside of cities or go camping can see the Milky Way and all of these stars, and us being humans, we see patterns and we give names to those patterns. But none of those patterns have the recipe for the perfect bread, the best bread. Because what is the best bread is in each of our hearts. And today, we're going to be exploring some breads from the 16th century, from the mid-1500s, that were definitely in the heart of people in England. I want to start with this text from Athenaeus, and this is by the son of the famous playwright Aristophanes. Such was the size, O master of the nastus, a large white loaf. It was so deep, its top rose like a tower quite above its basket. Its smell, when that top was lifted up, rose up a fragrance not unmixed with honey, most grateful to our nostrils, still being hot. This is the white bread dream. It was the white bread dream 2,000 years ago. It was the white bread dream 500 or 450 years ago when the recipes that we're dealing with today were made. And it's still a dream today. So that's the dream that is encapsulated in virtually every recipe here in this manuscript, and especially the part that we're dealing with today, which is written by somebody we only know by his initials, and that Malcolm is going to talk to us about very soon. But I want to get us centered into the 1500s. It's a real time, a real place, and I think sometimes it helps to sort of see something about the culture as we look at the bread. So this is Titian is working. It's the height of the Renaissance. Very powerful popes, very powerful queen in England, the queen who presided over England becoming a world power. And this manuscript is very much tied into that. I think Malcolm will mention Sir Hugh Platt, whose manuscript it is that we are dealing with, was a courtier in her court, was very important in the Elizabethan period, and really epitomized the engine of that growth. And this is Paris. This still exists today. This was created in the exact same time period as our manuscript, and all the period between manuscript and when Hugh Platt takes over, which Malcolm will explain. This was a new building. So you need to imagine really beautiful places, a lot of wealth, a lot of care, and white bread, white flour, manchet. That was their bread dream. Sir Francis Drake on the right, who was friends with a colleague of Sir Hugh Platt. I'd like to close this little introduction with some music, which hopefully will play. And lastly, this is when the Sistine Chapel was being painted. So this is where we are. And I now would like to turn this over to Malcolm to introduce the manuscript.
Right. Well, this is just a quick explanation of how the TT manuscript was discovered and where it is, as it were. I'm not going to talk about bread. I'll leave that to the experts. This is a notebook, part of the papers of the Elizabethan and Jacobean polymath Sir Hugh Platt, in which he recorded interesting secrets of all types, from gardening hints to alchemy, and including some descriptions of processes used in various trades. There are many recipes in this manuscript notebook, signed TT, arranged under various headings, such as bread, gardening, beer, cookery, dyeing, candle making, leather, ink, etc., etc. These recipes are not in Platt's manuscript, and TT's original page numbers have been crossed through, and his original book was split up by Platt. New blank leaves were inserted after each category of secret, and on these blank pages, Platt then added his own recipes and secrets. So it looks as though Platt used TT's original notebook as a skeleton of a notebook to which he added his own recipes. In the case of bread, the first 13 paragraphs are in TT's hand, and those numbered 14 and above are in Platt's hand. And the style of the recipes in the two hands is very different. TT's are, as William has said, and we will find out, didactic. Exact measurements are given. These are bread recipes to be followed by a reader, probably dictated by a professional baker to TT. I note there's mention of use of a brake in one of the recipes, a piece of equipment to knead bread dough associated with a bakery where substantial amounts of dough are required. In contrast, Platt's numbered paragraphs are almost all questions or conjectures about improving the efficiency of bread making or using substitutes for bread in flour. Example, Paragraph 15. Query of boiling beans in 1 or 2 changes of water, and after drying of them and grinding of them, and then mixing a convenient proportion of this flour with other flour, and so of peas. So the 2 parts of the bread manuscript were meant for different purposes. TTs were recipes to be followed, and plats were notes for further experiments to be made with baking. Who was TT? Well, the handwriting and spelling seem to indicate that he was writing some years before Platt, and this is confirmed by a couple of dates in his notes: a candle recipe dated 1559, and a comfit recipe dated 1561. In his published book on gardening, Platt reproduces many gardening tips from TT, and one is described as being by TT a parson. Well, TT's notes on repairing organ pipes and making candles indicate that he could well have been a priest. He gives a recipe for a candle for a trental, a sequence of 30 masses for the dead. This is a Roman Catholic rite. So TT could well have been a Catholic priest active in the 1550s during Queen Mary's reign. And I speculate even further that he may have been Thomas Thurland, a Catholic priest appointed master of the Savoy Hospital in 1557, who died in 1574. Thurland was, like Platt, an early scientist, interested in alchemy and metallurgy in particular. He was a founder shareholder of the Company of Mines Royal, a joint stock company set up by Elizabeth I to search for base metals in England. It began operations in the Lake District, mining copper. Probably to finance these mining activities, Thurland embezzled over £2,000 from the Savoy, and he was removed from office in 1570. As well as embezzlement, he was accused of allowing relatives to reside in the Savoy for free, sexual misconduct, and said to be a papist of scandalous life. But he doesn't seem to have suffered any sanction other than dismissal. And I wonder if Elizabeth recognised his expertise with minerals and let him off lightly. One point against TT being Thurland is that he was arrested for debt in Cumbria at one point and sent a letter asking for help from the prison to government officials in London. The handwriting in the letter did not match that of TT, but he could have dictated the letter, and he remains, I think, most likely to be the candidate for TT. Right, that's all I've got to say.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. Does anyone have any questions for Malcolm? This is your...
Could he repeat or spell the last name of the possible candidate? Thomas what? Thurland?
Thurland.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Malcolm?
Malcolm,
right.
Somebody wants to know, what is that crop behind that is showing behind you in your Zoom?
It's oh God, my mind has gone.
Fritillarias. Aren't they fritillarias?
Yeah, fritillaries.
Yeah.
Snake's head fritillaries. They grow naturally in a meadow beside the Thames at Ducklington.
Great.
On Ducklington Sunday, which is usually late April, the meadow is opened up and anybody can walk it, take pictures, and leave a donation. It won't be open this year because of the pandemic, but it'll probably give the Snake's Head fritillaries a chance to recover.
They're very beautiful. I love fritillaria. All right. They're the checkered. They have that checkered pattern. One more question, then we'll move on.
I just wondered, Malcolm, do you address all of what you were talking about TT in your book on Platt?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you very much. I will share the screen again and we will move on, hopefully. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is a bread that was recognized at its time as being an elite bread. This is from 1573. The laboring man that tilleth the fertile soil and reaps the harvest fruit hath not indeed the gain but pain. And if for all his toil he gets the straw, the Lord will have the seed. The manchet fine falls not unto his share, on coarse cheat his hungry stomach feeds. Now, you know, we are all feeding on manchet. So the manuscript you're looking at today, which at the time really was a bread for the elite, you know, it's not that a poor person may never, ever, ever have eaten a white bread ever. I don't think we should be completely rigid, but it was much more expensive because the milling process was more wasteful than our modern roller mill process that makes white flour really, really cheap. But the quality of the white flour you buy in the grocery is the same as what is in this manuscript. I have made the flour that's specified in this manuscript, and it is so close to our flour, there's no point in my making it. So I just buy, normally just buy the regular flour. So one thing we have seen in terms of this and history of bread is the manchet has been democratized. And the manchet loaf was always small. The 1 pound loaf is the biggest loaf ever made with the kind of flour that is in this manuscript. And of course, the 1 pound loaf, you know, is our standard loaf. And the hotel roll, that is the manchet roll. Right now, in our own time, there's a lot of interest in sourdough in Louvain. And I think, and this is for a different day to talk, I'm gonna have a separate session just on sourdough, but partly it's a way, I think, for us to feel connected to the past. It doesn't come in a packet. It isn't controlled by a corporation. Nobody profits from it. You can just make it yourself through fermentation. We need to get muted. Mute yourselves. Thank you. Spontaneous fermentation. Well, in the 1550s, this bread, this flour was associated with Rome, with classical Rome. And they even used the name, the Latin name in their texts. And this is from Thomas Cogan. The best kind of wheat was called in old times silago, whereof was made the finest bread called panis siligineus, which we call manchet, and was plentiful among the Romans and other nations also subject to the Roman Empire. So in our imagination, getting into the imaginative space of the 16th century, you need to think, wow, this lovely white roll. Wow, this is what Julius Caesar was eating. Wow, this is what Galen was eating. Wow. There is a way in which this bread is just bread. And on the right, I have a little picture from a Mexican bakery found online, the Mexican Kitchen. That is absolutely a little manchet. Someone from the 1500s would have recognized that instantly. Maybe not the bread from their baker, but recognized it instantly. Now, these are the Latin flour terms. They had two sets. The left is for what in Latin was called triticum, and they have four sections: bran, a seconds flour, a nice white flour, and then a double sifted white flour. So it's cibarium secundarium, and those would be the middlings. What Pavlik's ship's biscuits were made out of. Semilla is white bread, and pollen was used for the host. fine pastries and breads in early modern Europe. But there was a second set of bread terms, and this was for white wheat. And this includes the Siligo. And the names were slightly different. The white flour was called floss instead of semilla. Simnel, which we're going to be dealing today, is derived from the Latin bread terms on the left, from the triticum. I think it's a difference between red wheat and white wheat. To get the whitest white flour, hand sifting, you need white wheat. White wheat is Triticum aestivum subspecies aestivum. It's just red wheat, but it has a lighter pericarp. And so when you grind it, it becomes more invisible. So when you sift, your white flour will be whitest. Modern bakers use a white wheat in order to make these whitish whole wheat breads. When you see a whole wheat bread in a package that looks very white and the package says it's whole wheat, they're using white wheat. I want us to be in Rome for a moment, because again, I think that as we think about history and historical terms, we've got early modern, we've got classical Rome, we've got the Renaissance, we've got the medieval. When it comes to bread, really the world of bread's not divided up that way. These flours have been the same for a millennium. Now, a new idea that I came up with today for this talk, not today, last week. So manchet is absolutely, no question, the name of a style of bread. And it was a loaf that was 1 pound or smaller. It weighed, it had a very close crumb. So that's 450 grams. We read specifications at 8 ounces, which is like 220 grams, and 4 or 6 ounces, getting down to 110 gram, nice little rolls. It had a fine crumb, so no big air holes. The crust was pale. It would look like a par-baked loaf, like a loaf that you buy to bake again. And it also was made with a flour, ideally, that was sifted twice. So that comes up to a very fine pastry flour. And that is absolutely a style. And it even had, in some cases, certainly in the 16th century, 17th century, we know it was, you would make a ball, you would squat it down, you'd go a knife around the outside, scoring the waist, make 6 holes on the top and bake it. But I also think, and this is an epiphany for this talk, I also think that manchet is a flour grade. And when you think of it, in Gervase Markham's English Housewife 1614, which is the book that everyone working with early modern bread always looks to as the model, because he has 3 breads. He's got manchet, he has cheat, and he has brown bread. Now, brown bread is obviously the name of a flour, right? It's brown flour. In that case, in that recipe, it was a mix of grains, because he was basically baking slops for pigs and feeding them to the farm workers. The middle one, the cheat loaf, was, he says, the everyday loaf, and that's made with flour mix. It might be a coarse-ish grade of white flour, not wholemeal, not super white, not white. It's actually the most lovely flour. It's an 80% extraction flour, but it's a little bit brown. But also, cheat can be mixed with other grains. So you can have wheat with barley, wheat with rye, barley and rye, and that would be a cheat loaf. But the main loaf, he says, the best everyday loaf is manchet. But think about that. Manchet, cheat, brown. I think manchet's also the name of a flour. And he does say to bake the manchet with a soft oven, not to overdo the oven, but nonetheless, I think we could start thinking that way, that there's a dual use, so that you could go to a baker and you'd say, or you could go to a miller and say, what would you like? And he says, what flour would you like me to make? And you say manchet flour. And he says, do you want it single or double bolted? And you say single. And this tells the miller to use a 50 mesh screen that produces a 300 micron um, openings that would produce that flour. So it's just an idea to think about. Now, what's really, really important about this recipe, this manuscript, is it has an actual recipe for sourdough. It has a sourdough recipe. Jeff will be going over it as we work today. And remember, sourdough meant that you held back a piece of dough from the previous baking, and you mixed that with water and then flour, and that leavened your dough. This idea of holding back some dough and leavening the batch was something that was really, really central to the imagination of early modern preachers. They were fanatics about the leavened dough, generally in a pejorative way, generally negatively. Some bad, evil person would, give you an idea, and that idea would grow like leavening and turn you south. So they were very talked a lot about it. So it's clear from the sermons that the English people in early modern period, early period especially, were really thinking a lot about levain. But what's weird is that there really are no sourdough recipes in English cookbooks. None, zero, zilch. There's going to be one exception that I'm going to explain, but there are simply, until the late 20th century, English cookbooks don't have recipes that say, get some starter, hold back some dough, do this, and you can make yourself a really nice loaf of bread. The only exception, and it's a notable one, is the sourdough recipe in Hannah Glass's cookbook from 1747. She was a very powerful writer. The book was in print for over 100 years. So this is not a minor mention, not a minor example. But what's really weird about that recipe, in the notable way, is at the very bottom it says, from the Dublin Society. So the Dublin Society was the Irish academic science group, like the Royal Society. And I called them up and I said, look, I can't find the proceedings online. Do you have proceedings from the 1745, 46? And they said, actually, they don't, that they had burnt. So I wasn't able to get back to that manuscript. But what this indicates is that for Hannah Glass, what she's saying to people is, look at this curious thing. You can make bread with dough that you held back. But it wasn't standard and it wasn't picked up in other recipes. So it's really important here that we have this recipe. Sears fine your meal, then with liquor not scalding hot, mingle your leaven. Then with this liquor leavened, mingle almost half your flour as soft as pap, which is baby food, and work it well. Then cover the dough with the rest of your meal to keep it warm, that it may rise. Then let it stand 9 or 10 hours, or until it be well risen. Then work it well in the vat. Then break it well and make loaves thereof to settle into your hot oven. So, we're historians. You say, wow, far out. Look, it's clear the baker gave this recipe to TT, and they're making sourdough breads in England. Well, maybe. Here's the attitude about it. It's a very interesting time. Remember, this is the birth of the modern. There's a fantastic herbal health book by Thomas Cogan, 1584. And what's interesting here is that he is getting out from being between a rock and a hard place. So Galen, who was this, whose medical texts from the classical period really determined all of European medical thinking until about when Copenhagen of Health was written. He says here, oh, let me get it. So Galen says that the only good bread is bread that is leavened, that is made with leaven, whereby it appeareth that all kind of bread made without leaven is unwholesome. And after Galen descendeth slowly from the stomach, engenderingeth humors, causeth oppilations of the liver, increaseth the weakness of the spleen, and breedeth the stone in the veins, wherefore cakes of all sorts, including simnels and crackles that cracknels we're dealing with today, buns, and he goes on, are just by this rule absolutely forbidden. Don't touch them. They don't have leaven. And he's not saying that they're unleavened. They're saying they don't have levain. But then, after a little quote from in Latin, he says, "How be it?" And this is like the, it sends chills, really reading it, because here is the modern mind. This is what gives us our computers and these Zoom talks. Howbeit, nowadays, common experience proveth in men's stomachs that bread much leavened is heavy of digestion, and no bread is lighter than manchet, which is made of fine flour of wheat, having no leaven. So this manuscript by TT is for breads that have no leaven. They're looking forward. They're saying, here's the new world. We are breaking away from Galen. But there is this one recipe. And I just also found this in a medical book from 1694, and it's essentially the same recipe. He says the best sort for sick people is that which is made of wheat flour. But in this case, he doesn't want it super finely dressed. And he is going to then do the whole thing. He's mixing he's breaking up the dough in the water, the warm water. He lets it rise overnight, which I think is a better instruction in 6 to 10 hours, and then have to bake it. He also interestingly says, but the best way to make it is in thin cakes that you would bake in essentially a Dutch oven. And he mentions using rye, barley, or oats. So it's kind of an interesting recipe, but I want to really focus on the fact that there's really, I was very excited to find it, and it's not in a cookbook. It makes me think that the sourdough recipe we're going to work today was understood as a sick room recipe. And there's no salt in the manuscript. And when Jeff was testing it, we talked about how much salt to put in. Was that just left out because, this is a manuscript, it wasn't being prepared for publication. But what's at the end of the 1694 sickbed sourdough recipe is put no salt into your bread, ! Underline, underpoint, 100-point type, all red. So this recipe that we're making today does not have salt. There was a little bit of use of sourdough in a book by John Evelyn. Do you have the book handy, Malcolm? This is a book on salads, and Malcolm, who's a very nice person, but otherwise insufferable because of the fantastic quality of his library. So those of you who are collectors like me are jealous. So I'm asking him to read the recipe on page 53. And this is 1599. You're muted, Malcolm, you're muted.
Right. 53.
53. Take the pod.
Yeah, take the pods, then dry them well in a pan.
Oh,
When
let me
they
just
are-
wait, hold on, Malcolm. These are peppers, chili peppers. Okay, sorry.
Take the pods and dry them well in a pan. When they are become sufficiently hard, cut them into small pieces and stamp them in a mortar till dust. To each ounce of which add a pound of wheat flour, fermented with a little leaven. Knead and make them into cakes or loaves, cut longwise in the shape of Naples biscuits. These rebake a second time till they are stone hard. Pound them again as before and searce it through a fine sieve for a very proper seasoning instead of vulgar pepper. The mordicancy thus allayed, be sure to make the mortar very clean, and after having beaten Indian capsicum, before you stamp anything in it else, the greenhouse. Do you want me to carry on?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So he's talking about cayenne pepper in essence, isn't he?
That's right. He's making a little levain bread with cayenne pepper that he's then grinding up and then using that as the condiment. Thank you. I will share the screen again. So what I want to emphasize is that but John Evelyn, he translated the bread recipes from Bonifant's French Gardener. He translated the French Gardener by Nicolas de Bonifant, and he translated the bread recipes from Délices de la Campagne. The way you work when you're thinking as an historian is you see something like that, you need to think. Maybe everybody was familiar with this levain system, but maybe not. Maybe Evelyn is thinking about France. In the 1614 edition of English Housewife, Gervase Markham lists equipment that you need. And he says, you shall have a fair bolting house and large pipes to bolt meals in and fair troughs to lay leaven in. So, leaven meant both leavening, the general term, and it also meant leaven. I think he's meaning that in terms of just leavening in general, but mainly because we don't see, after this period, we really don't see any more use of leaven, of levain in British baking, except for that one recipe that I've read.
Dublin Society.
Excuse me, yes, Dublin Society bread recipe, right. The more typical example, there is only really 3 recipes or 2 recipes with yeast, with leaven in a standard British recipe, and it's in Dawson's Housewife in the Housewife in the Kitchen from 1593, and in Markham's English Housewife as well, the cheat recipe. And what you'll notice here is that she's saying to lay your dough in, to lay your dough for your bread and make a little hole in it and take a quart of fair water, blood warm, and put in that water as much leaven as a crab or a pretty big apple, and as much white salt as will fill an eggshell, and all to break your leaven in the water, and then put into your flour half a pint of good yeast. So she's using leaven and yeast, and in Markham's cheat recipe, it's leaven and yeast, not leaven alone. And that's why I feel that this recipe is really, really important, because again, it's an example of a 100% sourdough recipe from England, but I do think we should think of it as a medicinal bread. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the recipes, and then we're going to turn this over to Jeff, who's going to show us what he set up in his bakery, and we'll work together. The first page on the left and the first 2/3 of the middle page, that's in the handwriting of TT. And that's the portion really we're going to deal with today. We'll have a separate session on the notes by Platt, and they are very, very exciting, those notes, where he has lots of ideas. He was a man of ideas. Even in one of his books has a system for lowering down a flower pot from his balcony. So, I mean, lowering down a watering bucket from his balcony so that he can, he can, crank it up and water his house plants. On the left here is a photograph of a yeasted baguette from the King Arthur Flour website in the United States. And on the right is a sourdough baguette. And today, what we're going to be doing is just working the recipes. We've just worked these recipes to a point that they work. And they're roughly going to be 16th century style. But what I want to emphasize, and a big risk in recreating breads, is you end up just making the bread, you say, well, it's just bread. And I do want to encourage this idea that it's just bread, because I do think bread has been the same forever and a day. But bread is a subtle food. And what makes a difference to me, what I notice in a bread, someone else might not notice, or they do. Breads are carriers for social markers. And right now, we carry social markers in whether the bread is yeasted or whether it's sourdough. Now, looking at the outside, you can't tell. So this really is an angels on the head of a pin problem in many senses. And it's this level of subtlety that we need to get to in the 16th century. We need to find the style that matches Titian, that matches that beautiful courtyard in Paris, and of course, the equivalent of what's going on in England. We like big, beautiful, open crumbs right now. This on the left, this big picture, this is not what they were making. That much we know. And Jeff's redactions of these recipes are not going to give you anything with a big air hole. You can always just make it, add more water, make it your bread from today. There's two breads on the right from the early 1600s, so a bit later than this manuscript, but not that much later than when Platt was working. And I think those are probably both good candidates for breads you could make today. I think another time we're going to do a session on trying to copy breads from paintings. Remember, these were in beautiful places. This bread on the left, very similar to that roll that is being still made in Mexican bakeries. And that is, again, a good model, I think, for today. The one in the top and these ones on the bottom right are also modern. There are 20, I'm going to stop the share for a moment, if I can manage to do that. Do I have this to stop it? Okay, it's not stopping. So the first bread, I'm going to go over the breads. We have a few minutes. We're doing well. So the first bread, the first of these recipes is for 3/4 of a pound of fine searsed flour and a hot oven. So what's notable about all of these recipes is that they're for very small quantities of flour. The first other time I've seen a small quantity of flour is really that Henry Howard English French bread, that French bread recipe that we did from whatever it was, 1709 or 1706, something around that. That was making a bread with a pound of flour, 450 grams. It's really, really unusual. So while I think it's really clear that TT did ask somebody recipes, maybe more than one person recipes, I think. He was taking notes for some purpose that's completely unclear. These were home recipes. And I'm, assuming that they were given to a cook, to a baker, and that these were homes that probably had pastry ovens. So they didn't have to fire up a giant oven just to make it. Or if they did have to fire up a giant oven to make it, they didn't care about, about that cost. The second recipe is very similar to the first. It's very sketchy. It says flours per pound, work it as above, as you would make as the first recipe. But what's interesting, he says the barm in the weight of 12 pennies or a spoonful. And what's notable about this manuscript is it has details that no other early modern manuscript has, and it solves two vital problems. What is the weight of a spoonful? And the answer is 12 penny weights, and the penny weight is 1.55 grams. So a spoonful is 19 grams. I'm going to lean over here to get you a spoonful. I forgot to do that. Those of you who have early modern spoons, this is a Georgian spoon. This is exactly 19 grams. It's totally weird, but this is 12 penny weight worth of water. And he also specifies in this manuscript that the flour should weigh 16 ounces avoirdupois, and he's very specific because up to this point, bread was generally weighed in is something going wrong here? Whoa.
I stopped your sharing, William.
Okay. You stopped my sharing. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Thank you. So up to this point, most bread was weighed in troy weights, like we still weigh gold and jewelry that way. So he's being very specific. It's also a hint that this is a transitionary moment. And if you say that something's going to weigh a pound, that you actually have to specify which pound did you mean. So when I mill my own flour, and when I sift it through a 21 shilling cloth, which is a size that I got from a manuscript from the 1770s, I'd like to emphasize, in working in bread, you sometimes do need to move centuries. That is not a problem. The technologies were the same. The grain itself, you need to remember, has not changed size since it was domesticated 10,000 years ago. So it's going to divide up in the same parts. So he specifies that the grain should weigh 16 ounces avoirdupois per wine quart. Wine quart is the same quart that Americans still use, US customary measurements, and it's close enough to a liter that you just need to think 1 liter, 450 grams. And that's what mine comes out to when I use a 50 mesh screen, 300 micron screen. That's a little bit lighter than the flour that we buy. That comes out to not 32 ounces, but more like 36 or 39 ounces. But the baking quality is the same. So one great thing about this manuscript is it lets us prove that white bread was white. That when Gervais Markham, in his translation of the English house of the Maison Rustique from 1616, says that the flour was white as snow, it was white as snow. The next, number 3 recipe says 2 quarts of flour, and it makes 4 pretty loaves. It's all about the same. I think he talked to somebody else. There's a Christmas bread where he says to an average loaf, add 110 grams, a quarter ounce of aniseed. So there's an idea for you. Then we have the leaven recipe, then the manchet recipe, where he emphasizes in making the flour for the manchet that you sift it, and he says, don't go too far. And when you sift your flour, all of you that are milling yourselves, when you sift the first time, or when you resift, you will see, as you go through that fine cloth, you will see the color of the flour change. And it starts out really, really light because the shifting is causing the particles, the small particles to fall down, the big particles to rise to the top. That's why in New England, you've got all the field stones. I think that's why at the top of the soil, they're just slowly moving up, up, up. You are going to sift until you see that color just slightly change. And what that's going to give you is a very, very fine flour. I think Jeff Pavlik believes that a good substitute is pastry flour. There's a few more rules, and then we get to these fantastic simnels and cracknels. As far as I know, this is the only manuscript with a recipe for simnels and cracknels. Now, simnels were in the assize tables. They were in assize bread in the medieval period, so a long time ago, like in 1400. And again, we're in early modern. We're not in 1400. And they cost more than the other breads. And remember, the simnel is derived from the Latin flour terms from triticum. And I would suggest that is a reinforcing idea that triticum means red wheat. And what made the simnel expensive was not that it was made with a different wheat. They didn't switch over to manchet wheat, white flour, but they used that flour, but it is boiled like a bagel. And the cracknel is boiled like a bagel, but the cracknels will crack. And I guess I'm going to blow Jeff's punchline. But when Jeff tested them and gave it to his children, long-suffering bakery children to taste, he didn't tell them what it was, and they actually said, "Wow, Dad, these crack in our mouth, these crack under our teeth." So these cracknels crack. It's fantastic. These are, as far as I know, as I say, the only published recipes. Jeff will explain why he's making them in a circle. And certainly at some point when we move to get the details of these recipes more specific, I'm hoping that Ivan Day and maybe Peter Breers and some other people who have really worked in this area for decades will help us make breads that are really, really of the moment. I don't think I'm going to get too much into the recipes from Platt, but I'll read you one example. Will be knead your bread with new must of my raisin wine. Think that the same will give it a most delicate taste. Kneading with posset drink made of wine or ale. This will be a posset drink where you've essentially separated out the curds from the whey by acidifying a milk that you've heated and sweetened. It's quite delicious. So he's suggesting, well, why don't we make this slightly sweet bread using our favorite ale or wine posset. I made raisin wine. I guess I don't know if I should thank all of you guys or curse you that I made it to get the raisins to make the must bread myself, because it's really tasting really lovely as raisin wine. And I do have a tendency to drink the stuff up. So I think next time we'll get to those the Platt recipes that are really interesting for being creative. He also has a famine bread. He wrote a book on famine foods. So I think when we also do a seminar on famine foods, we'll get to the Platt. Are there any questions before I turn this over to Jeff? Anyone have a question for me? Do you want to speak up? We'll talk for answer questions for 5 minutes before turning it over to Jeff.
I've just got an observation. You mentioned that you'd use the Maison Rustic for information on bread. It might be worth you comparing the 1606 edition of Maison Rustic with the 1616 edition. The
yes, no.
1616 edition was edited by Gervase Markham, and he added bits to it to make it specifically applicable to England. And there's an index in the back of the bits that he's added, which is very instructive to see what he has added to the original French translation.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. Very good observation. I was aware of that, and yes, most of this bread stuff, a lot of the really detailed bread information in the 1616 edition is by Markham, and it's a really important extension of Markham's work that you need to read and understand, even as you're working with, say, Markham's recipes for horses, which is where he worked out his bread recipes. Originally were in his horse books, starting in the 1590s through the early 16th century, and then he gave us the English housewife recipes. I originally, yes, thank you, Markham. Daryl.
Yeah, you made the comment about how wheat hasn't changed. It's the same size today from ancient wheat. Did I take that correctly?
Yeah.
Well, the makeup of modern wheat, the endosperm is huge compared to ancient wheat. And that's, the controversy that people have about wheat affecting us more today than it did in past times.
Well, thank you. I am going to have a session on grains and ancient grains. The fact is that grain, there's different grades of grain. So there's and always has been, but in a number one grade wheat, Triticum estivum subspecies estivum, which has been around since the beginning of domestication, weighs 60 pounds per bushel. These are, the US dominates the grain trade, so these are numbers that are also international. But a 60 pound per bushel for a number one grade wheat is the same now as it was in Rome. Pliny's all work out, bread numbers work out to that number as well. So there may have been some changes, but really the grain size is the same. I'll call on Zoe and then Nancy Jenkins.
Hi. Yes, there was one mention of a time frame, so 9 to 10 hours in one of the recipes, and I'm curious as to when that kind of temporality or concept of time comes into recipes, specifically in baking.
Okay, so Zoe, that's a good question, and it's really a question about coming into recipes, not, of course, coming into baking. So until printing, all these recipes were private. Nobody shared them, or they just shared them, but they couldn't. People rarely saw anybody else's written bread recipes. So at first, a lot of bread recipes were written really like these ones by TT. If you don't know how to make bread, they don't do you a whole lot of good. They were really notes. The recipes have been getting more and more detailed, and the reductive ad absurdum of detail is, of course, today. I'm very fond of a brioche recipe in an American book called The Bread Bible that runs to 10 pages compared to the one paragraph in the edition, the French book that it came, sorry, I'm getting flustered. I'm losing a name of the author. There is a magnificent first modern brioche recipe from the 1760s. And that recipe is one paragraph. It makes fabulous brioche, but now it's like 10 pages. So the answer, Zoe, is that those times come into the recipes as the people baking them have lost skill. Also, of course, a commercial recipe is always very time conscious. So I
Okay.
would recommend the recipes from the Liste de l'Accompanying by Nicolas de Bonifant, 1654, translated by put into English by John Evelyn, and I published that in the Petit Propos Culinaire.
Cool.
I might have a version online. I should. I'll post it. So,
That'd be great.
so-
Thank you.
and you could Google search it. So it was in Houghton's. Never mind. I'm getting aphasia.
Oh.
Okay,
Thank
but
Now, one of the most important aspects of the question that you just asked is the environment. You know,
Yeah.
how humid it is, how hot, etc. That's really, that seems to be the thing that we've lost most of all, is that where you are now in an environment, now that we have such industrialized, we have such capacity to industrialize everything that we make, we tend to forget that in the past that was not an option. So
that's
Yeah.
right. And Ken, thank you. I want to get to Jeff, but let me respond to that and get back to Zoe. So one thing is that they couldn't control their environment the way we can. So there's a lot of focus on mixing the dough always with hot water, with warm water. They made the door warm. They specified put it in a warm place. So they were controlling time that way. But of course, we don't have the inner recipe structure, and you all know who are bakers, bread is time and temperature, and whether you stretch that out or speed up the rise affects how it tastes, whether you add liquids at different times. So most of that we don't know. I would now like to turn this over.
I just had one comment about Zoe's question. Zoe, were you asking like a concept of 9 to 10 hours versus overnight? Back in the 1500s, what did overnight mean? I mean, back then, an 8-hour night wasn't typical, maybe?
Yeah, and I think this is a reference from studying medieval recipes, who kind of implicitly say like, oh, sing a song for 3 times and then you can let the bread rise. And so it was more of a curiosity as to when that kind of conception of exactly that, like how can one determine time overnight. I agree. And is it specific to the person who's baking? Is it a professional, or is it a housewife? So that was where the question stemmed from.
Zoe, do
Can
you
I
have a
add-
recipe?
can
Do
I
you
add
have a
something to
medieval
that?
recipe for bread that has singing?
I don't know if I have a medieval recipe specifically for bread with singing, but I do have medieval recipes with stinging. But I can
Yeah,
try to
okay.
look into bread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can
I'm
I add
gonna move
something
on.
to that? May
because-
I add something to that, please?
Yeah.
It still exists to this day, and I had an experience the first time I made fresh pasta in Italy, and the woman with whom I was making it, I said to her after the pasta was dried, "How long should I cook it?" And she said, "Basta dire un Ave Maria." You just have to say an Ave Maria. That's how long you have to cook it. So that concept still exists in some areas. Yeah.
Great. And welcome. This is Nancy Harmon Jenkins. I don't want to cut into Jeff's time, but go to Amazon and look up her books. She's a fabulous cookbook writer.
Thank you.
And I really admire her work. Okay, Jeff, take it over. Take it over.
Okay, William, what kind of time do we want to tell people we have left? Like, are we expecting
Well, I mean,
15
officially it
minutes
ends
or?
at 10:30. We'll leave the room open, but we have 15 more minutes of the official session.
All right, and we are all set up. Hello, welcome. My name is Jeff Pavlik. Welcome to my bakery. This is Sunflower Bakehouse in Michigan, in the Great Lakes of North America. What we've done is I have the breads from this manuscript. We redacted them, we worked on them, and I'm going to try to answer some of your questions, and we're just going to produce them right now. The first one we're going to talk about, of course, is this manchetta recipe. It's very clear. It gives a precise amount of flour, and it gives a sense of what the dough is going to look like. So what we're going to do is the recipes that I had written out. We know that we're going to start with the set amount of flour. We're gonna put that in the middle of the bowl. The barm that they're calling for. This is barm from a brewery that we've actually kept for years. If you watch it, you'll see the fermentation on top, right? It's active barm. It's calling for new yeast. So generally that would be as it's fermenting, that top fermentation, that yeast that's kind of on top of fermenting beer, because this is not beer, it's actually ale. So we're gonna be dealing with ale yeast, which rise to the top versus lager yeast, which will fall. So the ale yeast will have more of this sort of, active culture. This wine that I made as well, you might be able to see the fermentation on top. See all this bubbles going on where the must is. These are top fermenters. You can keep it for longer, and you'll have your barm. It might not be as active. You can reactivize it, but it's very potent stuff. So we're going to take our amount of water and our amount of barm. We're going to add it in. It doesn't actually call for salt, but we know that we can add salt probably like in the range of a couple grams, way under 2%, maybe even 1%. So barely a pinch. And then we're going to mix that together. This flour that I'm using customers. I am a working bakery. I'm just going to turn that off. Sorry. The flour that I chose was pastry flour for two reasons. Number one, it has a nice white color to it because it's generally always unbleached, but it's still, so it's a natural white. And number two, it's lower in gluten. We know that a lot of the flours available, we're going to be lower gluten flours. So it gives you that lower sense of gluten. So the stretchability, the elasticity is not going to be much. All they say is mix it together and then make a dough. This dough has risen for an hour. I mixed it right at noon, so it's a little over. Without kneading it yet, you can see that it just kind of has its own elasticity, right? I haven't kneaded this at all. This is just that flour, water, and the barm. And you look, we can already get some nice elasticity out of pastry flour. It then is going to say to work it, knead it, break it, right? So a break, we could use a rolling pin. We know that in general, breaks are connected on one side and move back and forth. So we could just take and make the break and break it for a while. I will say that all of my breads, I timed this out so I could do it quickly because I kind of expected us to have this amount of time. So I didn't really knead a lot of my breads very well because I was going for time. So I will say they're all under kneaded. Bad mistake on my part. But here are the first manchettes. So what I came up with is I did them with both recipes. So out of barm, we have a well-risen manchette. Let's crack it open and see. We have no crust. We have no crumb. You know, it's dense. It's hearty. It has risen, obviously. A very light crust on top, pale white, something that we might expect. This we made with the yeast from, as if you're going to just use yeast if you don't want to bother using barm. But once again, it's going to have a really tight crumb. That's what we're going for, this light crust, light crumb. I said I didn't work them really well, so I had some breakages. William did mention a recipe using the must of the raisins. That's what I did here, and it's really just fantastic. I know both of our raisin wines, we were taste testing them last night, smelling them and like, whoa, this thing's pretty volatile stuff. So those are your manchettes. Straightforward, a simple dough recipe. It's very well written out. The beauty of these recipes is that he's clear on every ingredient. So then let's talk about sourdough. I want to try to explain. I saw a lot of the chat, and I want to try to refocus our attention on sourdough. We're in a culture right now in which sourdough is a thing that you start adding flour and water. You let active bacteria and fungus come and inhibit it. Then you feed it, you nurture it, you tend it, you then discard some of it to refeed it, you get it going, it takes X amount of time to be active. And there's this entire modern sourdough culture. That's not what we're dealing with. I want to try to take away the idea that in these recipes, in this recipe, and in any recipe that we read of sourdough, you'll never read the word discard. Discard is a modern notion of excessive amounts of flour in our life. What you see in these sourdoughs is that you're pinching off a piece of dough from the dough you're making. It includes your flour, your water, your salt, and the yeast from the previous batch. You then set that aside, and we have it will continue to ferment. So this is the barm that I started 5 days ago. So I made a batch of bread with barm. Then I made the dough, pinched it off. Next day, made a batch of dough, following these instructions, pinched it off. Made a batch of dough, next day. So this is like day 5. And this is what the sourdough looks like with barm. It's elastic, it's risen. It has the same characteristics as if I did the same thing with yeast. So if we use modern yeast and bread or beer yeast, right, the same species, they're giving you the same effect. These are just both pieces of dough that have turned sour that we use to re-inoculate the next batch. This is my sour that I use at the bakery. This is 20-something years old of just refreshing it with rye flour. I started this just with the microbes in at the bakery, but then I just continue its process. The difference is that I keep this separate. When I need it, I take it out and I make a batch of dough. Then I put this back. In this process that we're talking about, the bread and the sourdough are in a complete cycle. They're just going back and forth on each other. There is no discard. There's no setting it aside and then and it being separate than the bread. It's one and the same. Much like how the beer yeast that they're using are coming from the last batches of beer. So it's just this continual cycle. We now separate out the function of food and the function of leavening. They had them much more intertwined. You want to say something?
Yes, I did. Fabulous explanation. But something you said the other night that I'd like to say.
Oh, did it actually make enough sense to repeat?
You did. So one thing he's saying is, you know, since you had the bread, right? You had the bread you made when you opened the bakery, but then you're taking off a piece, or when you got married, because remember, most bakers were women. Jeff's a man, but that's commercial. Bakers were women. You guys were the bakers. Us guys were not the bakers. The first bread you made, if you're in the Levant tradition, you take off a piece, hold back a piece, bake this part, then that goes to the next bread, to the next bread, to the next bread, to the next bread for your whole life. If a bakery was in business for 100 years, there's a little bit of that first bread. So it's a beautiful chain of transmission. And then I just think that technically what's happened now is that the exigencies of bigger bakeries, they want to make this, you know, they need to make the sourdough. It's liquid, it's easier to handle. They make big quantities, it's fast. But before 1900, certainly, there's no evidence that I've ever run across for the kind of starter we're using. And lastly, just to emphasize something he said, I am not a sourdough person. I just don't have the personality for it. I can't keep it going. So what I do when I want a nice sourdough is I make a yeasted dough, I put it in the refrigerator, and a week, 10 days later, I have a beautiful sourdough. And remember that the wild yeast in most sourdough cultures is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same yeast in the packet. So that's my
Okay, so we have in this like sourdough, non-sourdough tradition, we're talking about the sourdough. Markham talks about the dough trough, the scrapings from the dough trough, and just mix your bread, add hot water. That's just this old dough, right? All of this is inhibited with yeast, inhabited by yeast as well. So this is a possible medium for the next batch of bread. Or you can use this piece of old dough to go to your next batch. What this recipe calls for is to take and make a hole in your flour. So you add all your flour, you make a hole, and then you add your water, and then you take this piece of sour, and you add it, you mix it in, and you let it mingle, make it a slurry, and then you add the second half of flour on top. So this is sit for the last 10 hours. So this is what it looks like. You can actually see it's rising. This is all made from a barm sour that was started 5 days ago. So this is the process. We're way far into the process at this point. So a bread made with a barm, then that piece of dough was kept and transferred and transferred and transferred. And you can see that the activity of just that little piece, I'm only using 10%, right? My recipe's small. The Hannah Glass recipe is really a 2% recipe. Some other ones, you'll see it up to a 20 to 30%, depending if it's summer or winter, especially in the French tradition. The French tradition of sourdough that's different than what we're talking about here is this is a one-stage build. We're taking our piece of leaven, adding it to the water, throwing the flour on top, and building our bread. The French, later in the 17th, 18th century, start to specify that this would be your first build. Then you would add more. Then you'd build it a second time. Then you'd get to your final build. And then that would be for your total amount. And then you would take a piece of that dough and set it aside. So the French are using the same sort of methodology of old dough sourdough. It's just that they're going through multiple builds, a whole lot more control. We know that from the 18th century text, sourdough was very well, was not used or was very poorly used throughout England. It's just, there's so many texts that talk about how yeah, this is really bad. They don't know what they're doing. It doesn't mean that it was dead. It just means that it wasn't the cultural taste. England is a country of brewers. They have plenty of ale yeast. France is not. This tradition changed in France than England, but we have this recipe which shows the tradition as it starts, or as at least recorded, in the mid-15th and 16th century. So this dough will then just be mixed up like a dough. We'll bring all this flour together and we'll make us a dough. Once we make that dough, we'll break it and we'll mold it. I came out with several different loaves. Again, I didn't mix these well enough. I get it. This is a sour barm bread. This is the sourdough recipe. And it came with 3 rolls and 1 larger loaf. The larger loaf, let's look inside. Again, thickly, it's definitely risen, right? You can see that, William? The crumb?
Yeah,
So
well, you're
that
right.
is from a piece of barm. If you do this at home with a yeast
Jeff,
and then
can you
give it a
hold
couple
it
times.
further away from the camera? We can't see the crumb.
Okay, is
Yeah.
that better?
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a beautiful skylight in my bakery, which is we don't get a lot of sun in Michigan. And of course, it's coming right now. So I can't tell what it looks like. So this is what from the yeast. This is 5 days of old dough. But you can see that it's still got a little bit of air holes going on. I got some openings there. With the barm, it's definitely has a lot less of that eyelet. It's definitely a firmer bread. But the actual rise was pretty much the same. I mean, dinner rolls in comparison, barm is not necessarily any different than yeast. That's what we're trying to get to. It is yeast. It's the same thing.
Okay, 2 things. Yeah, barm and yeast. I mean, there was no bread yeast until ale yeast was isolated.
But they're doing the same thing. We can see that they produce the same loft.
Yeah, they do the same thing. But what I wanted to say is that he's got big air holes in there. And we do know from paintings, a lot of rolls you'll see have a deep cut and they open up completely and you can see air holes. So when I say that the crumb for the manchet should be very fine, I think that's completely true. But the manchet flour was used for breads that did have, larger air holes.
Any other questions on sourdough?
Okay.
Yeah, Jeff, when you were doing that, were you folding or kneading in any special way? Trying to create?
What's that?
Were you trying to create any captured carbon dioxide?
I would have hoped to have gotten. I used the break. I mean, I just don't know how much time we have. So I mean, I can once the dough was made. I have the doughs here ready to make. I was using the break to do it, and we have time. I just want to run through it all. If people want to stick around, I'll finish these off. How about that?
Okay, let's start. Hold on. It's 10:30. So and Gooding has her hand up. So let me just say, but did you do the cracknels?
No,
today?
I was about to show them. That's why all I want to do is show the cracknels and simnels.
Okay,
so
the
cracknels and simnels.
Okay.
So this dough here, it says make it like pap. It's like make it really make it like gentle like pap. This dough is incredibly elastic. Maybe too elastic, we don't know, but we went for what the recipe said. It's still very workable. It's just incredibly high hydrated. We then make that into a wreath or a rope like a wreath, which means round. They also use the word to describe it as trendle, which is a ring of stones. So we get out of those two words in the text of Old English, this idea of going round with it, right? And then we have people remembering that it was round. In the 19th century, when they're talking about them, they tend to think that this is where we go. So we have this, basically this bagel. We boil it, and then we take it out, and then we bake it. Let's see if we can hear it crack. Not really. I mean, it cracks. I don't think you're going to hear it.
Okay.
But it definitely has a crack
Heard
to it. The outside crust cracks. The simnel is the same dough. They say it's like cake. Because it's hydrated, it tends to, when it hits the water, it flattens out. I don't know if that's what they're saying as far as like a plate. You know, they sometimes say plate, but this is brushed in saffron. A saffron glaze, gorgeous color. So we saffron glaze it, and you can see it on there. Again, it has a kind of a dense inside.
Can you hold it
They're
further
very
away?
elegant.
Yeah, further
What's that?
away from the camera, Jeff.
Oh, sure. They're very elegant. I can hardly hear. I'm sorry. So they're very elegant. These simnels then get modified. So we see in the early 18th century adding fruit to them. We still see them boiled, and we still see them baked. We have, of course, the old adage that Simon and Nellie were trying to make a cake, and one said boil and one said bake. So they combined them to make the simnel, Simon and Nellie. Who knows? What we do know is that it continued to be boiled and baked until the 19th century, when it became more of a cake as it progressed, and now it's a completely different marzipan covered, cake. But this is what we can go back to. We also see the word simnel, like William said, in the assize tables, and we see the word simnel used for fine white flour. So we have, again, this relationship between the baked good and the flour name, and where it fits in the hierarchy of whiteness of bread and flour.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. So that's I just want to say, okay, Anne has her hand up. We'll do Anne, and then I'll formally close the session, but we'll keep the room open. Anne.
Okay, it's partly a comment, because leaven, and there's a couple of comments in the chat on this as well. Leaven was still being used in the Second World War. The idea of keeping the bread, keeping some dough back, and not using it every day. But I mean, my grandmother her baking day was once a week, and she kept leaven back. And that's what she learnt from her mum in a farm workers house, effectively farm workers family in Wales. So I mean, leaven I think appears. I suspect the text that we have for recipes give us what's being written about in the larger houses, the important people, and then as you get into the start of early modern and through into the Renaissance, you start to get a middle class. But what's actually going on in cottages around the country is people are using leaven, and they're baking once or twice a week, and it goes a bit sour in between, but they don't call it sourdough. And there are no instructions anywhere on how to keep leaven.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. Okay, I just want to thank you, Anne. That's a completely brilliant comment, and absolutely right on. And it points out the whole problem with historical research that's text-based. So it's exactly right, and what she says. We know, I think we do know from the texts that that at the middle class and up level was not interested in sourdough and levain.
Yeah, the leaven oftentimes was just kept in flour. That you'll read. Sometimes they actually put salt inside of it, wrap the salt around, and toss it in there. Other times you'll just see put it in the flour box, or to set it aside, which will form a thick crust, but the inside will kind of stay a little bit more alive for a little bit longer, and then you just break it up. Really no differently than you break up the outside of your bowl. So yeah, I mean, I think saving it is just pretty easy. You just stick it in your flour.
But I think, Anne, I think Gervais Markham suggests storing it in salt. But anyway, thank
Yes.
you, Anne. That's a perfect comment and a good ending, that the research is not done, the thinking needs to continue, and we all need to think, and hopefully we can create a more accurate picture of what really went on in people's lives with bread in the past. So thank you all for coming. We still have 100 people. It's fabulous, exciting to be speaking and have such an audience, and you've been a wonderful audience. We'll leave the room open for another half an hour, and Jeff can continue. We can talk amongst ourselves. I'll answer questions. So let's have a big round of applause. Thank you for, I guess, for me, for Jeff, and for Malcolm.